Hey everyone, in this video, we're going to be talking about some maps and slavery. So we're going to draw inferences about slavery by analyzing maps of the slave trade. Here's the first map I want us to look at. What we see here are the number of people that were taken from their homes in Africa, put on ships, sent across the ocean, and sold as slaves in North and South America, right? So this is a map of the slave trade. And we're looking at these numbers occurred over the course of 400 years. So this is how many millions of people were taken from their homes in Africa and sold as slaves in North and South America over the course of about 400 years. And so as we look at it, the thicker the line, right, the thickness of the line represents the number of people. So we can see that about 5.6 million people were taken from West Central Africa, and almost 2 million people were taken from Bight of Benin. Almost about 1.5 or 1.5 million people were taken from other parts of West Africa. So we see that the thickness of the line represents how many people were taken. And then we can look over here to the west, right? And we can see where they all went. So we can see that more than 2 million enslaved people were sent to Southeast Brazil. Then we look up here to where the United States is today. So these would have been the colonies, right? The English colonies that we've been learning about lately. And we can maybe pat ourselves on the back and say, well, gosh, compared to other places, not too many enslaved people were sent to the United States. So I guess we weren't so bad, right? Now, if we were to try to figure out where the majority of people went, most enslaved people were actually sent to the Caribbean, right? These islands in the Caribbean. And you might be like, oh, but those are tiny little skinny lines. They're also tiny little skinny islands, right? So they can't fit very many people. But if we look at like how thick this line is, that represents millions of people were sent to the Caribbean over the course of about 400 years. So the Caribbean is where most enslaved people were sent. So the real question is why? Now, one thing we need to think about is that it was the Spanish that colonized the Caribbean, right? So it wasn't the English, it was the Spanish who colonized that area. So these probably would have been Spanish conquistadors and Spanish colonizers who were involved in the slave trade in the Caribbean. But why were they bringing so many slaves there? That's the real question we need to figure out. So again, it kind of looks like what became the United States, right? The British colonies were certainly involved in slavery, absolutely, but not as much as the Spanish down in the Caribbean. Not so fast. Let's look at this map, though, okay? This map shows us some different trade routes that were going between different parts of the world at this time. And so we can follow this blue line. It goes from Great Britain. They were bringing manufactured goods and furniture and other luxuries over to the 13 colonies from Britain, right? And then from the colonies, we were sending things like flour and fish and meat over down into the Caribbean, right? And then from the Caribbean, they were sending things like sugar and molasses and fruit over back to Great Britain and the rest of Europe. So there's kind of like this little triangle of trade going on. In fact, this is called the triangle trade. But another one of those triangles is down here. If we look where Africa gets involved, okay? Look what's coming from Africa in this blue line. They're actually putting enslaved persons right next to gold and pepper, as if people are just a list of things that they're sending from one place to another. I want us to wrap our minds around that people were considered things to be traded back and forth around the world during this time. And that's what the transatlantic slave trade was. This part of the triangle trade was called the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage refers to putting Africans on slave ships, shackling them in chains, tying them down, sending them across the ocean to then be sold as slaves in the West Indies or the Caribbean or up here in the colonies, okay? As well as down in South America too. So let's look at, we've got enslaved people coming from Africa to the Caribbean. And then from the Caribbean back up to the colonies, they're sending more enslaved people. So it's like they just took a little break and then continued on their journey. But they're also sending molasses and sugar. Molasses and sugar is made from sugar cane, right? It's an agricultural product. It's a plant. And that's why they needed so many slaves in the Caribbean, because they were growing sugar cane. And that sugar cane was used to make sugar and molasses as well as rum, a kind of alcohol. And those things were then sent to the colonies. So what's actually going on, I'm going to go back to our previous map here. All of these people are being enslaved and sent to the Caribbean to work on the sugarcane fields so that then sugar could be sent to the colonies. Do you see what's really going on there? Even though not as many slaves are going straight to the colonies are actually pushing slavery forward, because in the colonies, they wanted their rum and their sugar and their tasty treats, which came from the Caribbean, which was harvested on the backs of slave labor. So what we're really seeing is that, yes, fewer slaves were going straight to the colonies. However, it is because the colonies wanted sugar that so many slaves were sent to the Caribbean to work the sugarcane fields and then send that sugar to the colonies. So that's the deeper picture of what's really going on here, right? Just because not as many slaves were coming straight to the colonies are still part of this slave trade. And they pushed slavery even more because we wanted sugar. And sugarcane really only grew in the Caribbean. And so that's why so many enslaved people were sent there. So I hope we can kind of see the bigger picture now about how looking at a couple of maps can kind of help fill in the gaps with what really happened in history.